こんにちは皆さん、ミレニアムキッチン綾部和です。今回ギルド02に、怪獣が出る金曜日という、以前から温めていたタイトルをぶつけます。今回のコンセプトはズバリ巨大怪獣が出るヒーロー番組の中の世界、その中で暮らす子供となってあなたはこの世界を体験することができます。例えば、自分の真上にいたらこんな見た目になるのかとか、あと自分の家がもし壊されそうになったらどんな気持ちになるのかとか、内容もかなり充実したものになっています。本当に自信を持っておすすめできる作品ができましたので、皆さんぜひダウンロードして遊んでみてください。損は絶対にさせません。
This is the face of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. Probably because he did it for, 13 years at this point? Jesus Christ. If I could choose someone to direct my vacations, I would definitely choose this man. Now, I know you might be a bit confused. This was a Boku no Natsuyasumi Retrospective, wasn't it? And the Boku Natsu games are done, so the retrospective is done, right? Right. Well, not exactly, because on our journey, I've kind of talked about every single game ever released by Millennium Kitchen except for one. That's right, Boku no Natsuyasumi 124, Bokura no Kazoku, and one more game are the entire output of Millennium Kitchen. Well, except for the portable remasters if you want to count those. So what do we say we go for broke and simply end up doing a Millennium Kitchen retrospective instead by just covering this one last game? Well, I can't actually talk to you through a pre-recorded video, so I'll just assume that if you're still watching this, you're okay with this idea. Are you okay with it? Are you still watching? Okay, then you're okay with it. Well then, let's talk about the very last game released by Millennium Kitchen, Attack of the Friday Monsters: A Tokyo Tale. But before we talk about that, we must talk about the collections of indie tier smaller titles organized and released by the famous Japanese developer Level 5 known as Guild 01 and Guild 02. Now, just from looking at this cover, a lot of feelings can be conjured up. You might think this might be a mystery game, a detective game, or maybe a pretentious drama, and if you knew it was made up of short games, then you could think it might be a series of experimental itch.io kind of titles conjured up by the mind of a slightly insane individual in the basement of the Level 5 office building. But the reality is... yeah. Turns out the cover is like this not as an indication of the content, but because indicating the content with a clean image is kind of impossible considering how wildly varied it is. Sure, they could have just picked the 4 games and shoved in concept art in the box to indicate what it was all about, but if you want to clip one simple concise image, you simply have to go for as neutral and/or as abstract of a look as possible. And they went with the creepy statue-like face because it made for a unique image. At this point your guess is as good as mine. But the point I want to get to is, Guild 01 was a collection of games from various game directors and designers of all levels, from the relatively unknown to niche darling Suda51 himself, and they even got a Japanese comedian who did the writing, not the directing of one of the games, so don't get too confused about it. Or maybe he did the directing, I have no idea, I believe he only did the writing. But the games, wow, the games were all over the place. From a super condensed RPG played with actual 3D miniatures and dice, to aerial combat with anime girls, the collection had everything. Now, I don't have sales numbers, but clearly it must have worked the first time around because they ended up doing a Guild 02, which included a bug RTS, a cool and creepy sci-fi horror adventure, and the game we are actually going to be talking about today, Attack of the Friday Monsters. And oddly enough, despite this being the last game ever released by Millennium Kitchen, it was actually the first game of theirs I ever played, since, well, it is the only one that to this day has been officially released in English. Now, I've played through all of the Guild titles, as all of them, some sooner than others, ended up being released in the West, not in their original cartridge format, but digitally on the eShop. And I've known about Boku Natsu for a long time, ever since I was a child. Now, you might ask, how did you know about that? Well, I've been obsessed with niche video games since I was a child, always trying to find the rare and the unknown. And one magazine about PlayStation games that I had, not the official magazine I think, but it's been too long, my memory is kinda shot, but one of them had a small little bubble on the side of one of the articles with screenshots of what I can now identify as the second Boku no Natsuyasumi game on them, with the writer of the article talking about this neat Japanese series that never got translated. And ever since that fateful day in which I read that article, I've had this series on the back of my mind for the longest time, wanting to play the games, but never hearing anything about them coming to the West until 2013, when they announced Attack of the Friday Monsters, and I saw people talking about how it was made by the director of the legendary Boku no Natsuyasumi series, and yes, of course, I had to absolutely rush to the eShop and buy it as soon as it was possible to finally experience what I've been missing for years. Naturally, I knew this was just going to be a small Guild 02 sized version of what Boku no Natsuyasumi might have been, but that was enough to turn my niche instincts into overdrive. In the end though, what I've got was something very different from what I had expected at first. Attack of the Friday Monsters, A Tokyo Tale, is a game developed by Millennium Kitchen in partnership with a bunch of people and published by Level 5, and you know how many publishers express worries about how international audiences might not understand their games when they are deeply related to Japanese culture and iconography? Well, this one cuts right to the chase by straight up explaining the history, themes, and the lens you should use when interpreting the story. How kind of them? As for the story itself, it takes place in 1971 and is focused on a young boy who just moved to Tokyo called Soda. His parents are dry cleaners and he absolutely loves the giant monsters colloquially known as kaiju, so of course it's a dream come true that he ended up moving right next to the TV station where his favorite kaiju show is filmed and that mysterious events, which include giant footprints showing all over the city, have been happening. It's the chance of a lifetime for a kaiju fanatic as he joins his fellow classmates and together with them explores the city while being narrated by a character that may or may not be crucially relevant to the plot later on. But how does he do all of that exploring? Well, when it comes to the actual gameplay, I'd like to recall a moment at the very beginning of this video series when I had trouble describing just what the gameplay of Boku no Natsuyasumi was. I could make some comparisons, but all of them would leave something at the core of the game out. It was ultimately a very unique experience built from familiar blocks. Well, when it comes to Attack of the Friday Monsters, for better or for worse, I can easily describe exactly what the gameplay is. It's an adventure game harkening back to classic point-and-click games, except the puzzles are exceedingly simple. While this might disappoint some who wanted this game to simply be an extension of Millennium Kitchen's previous titles, I personally think they did an excellent job here, even if several series staples, like the progress of time and a diary, are completely missing. Well, that's not really the case. There is one time progression scene, but it is very specific. It's not like the progress of the calendars from the previous games. But this is after all a completely new game with completely different character designs, though it does pull a few tricks from the head of knowledge that the developers had accumulated until now, including the use of beautiful and lush 2D pre-rendered backgrounds to give the game an incredibly unique sense of charm, and you can even use the tank controls as well if you really want to. They are here, they are available. The character design, for the first time in a Millennium Kitchen game, was not designed by veteran Mineko Ueda, and instead by Shinsuke Homa, who I couldn't find anything about besides working on this one game. But whoever he is, he did a great job here. The characters look very charming with a style that reminds me of shonen manga, but has more of a softer edge to it, like something aimed at young children, which, yeah, that makes absolute sense considering the atmosphere this game goes for. As for the puzzles, if you can call them that, since you have no inventory to work with, they mostly consist of going from one place to another and trying to talk to the right person or interact with the right object to make the plot progress. The objects of which are usually marked on your map for that extra little bit of brainlessness. It isn't focused on trying to get you thinking so much as to provide a smooth path between plot points while still allowing for just a little bit of exploration. The objectives themselves are divided into episodes, but episodes work in a very non-linear format. You don't need to finish one episode to end up starting another, and some episodes will open up in the early game yet only reach their conclusions at the very end. I personally really like this messy order since it reminds me of Boku Natsu's open-ended design. You're not supposed to know how to handle everything. Everything is not supposed to fit neatly one after the other. You just go with the flow and eventually things will be alright. Of course, that's not everything the game has to offer, since as you might have noticed from the footage, that I've been catching a bunch of glowing lights on the ground as I explore. Those are monster glimpses, and when you collect enough of them, you get a kaiju monster card. Hey look, we found an American! As for the purpose of the cards, they are meant to be used to play the only minigame present in this game, the card battles. After a certain point, Soda can challenge any of his friends to battle using the monster cards. The rules are simple. You select 5 cards, your opponent selects 5 cards, and then each card face each other in a battle of rock, paper, scissors based on a symbol on the face of each card. Of course, when you place your cards, you can see them, but you cannot see the opponent's cards, which are always face down. But the game then shows hints to you about the matchups, showing the results of some of the battles, but not all of them, so you can have an idea of which matchups you lose, draw, or win in. And finally, both players must change the positions of 2 of their cards, regardless if they are winning or losing. This is interesting because you must switch even if you are winning, so you might be trying to avoid a desperate situation or trying to avoid rocking the boat too much, depending on the initial predictions. Naturally, that leads to another question. What if the cards draw? Do they simply draw and that's it? Well, not at all, because then the strength number of each card is measured to figure out who will win, since different cards have different strength numbers. And if you end up gathering multiple copies of the same card, you can fuse them together to increase their strength up to 2 times per card. So while this is the only minigame this time around, you can tell that it's got quite a bit of interesting depth to it to make it worthwhile to pay attention to. And of course, in a very charmingly silly fashion, whoever wins the games becomes the master of the other character, and you can invoke a spell on them at any time to make them fall down. It's silly in a very kid-like fashion, but leave it to Millennium Kitchen to take the extra step necessary to allow you to build your own silly spell in the menu that does nothing except for making the spell feels extra customized for you in particular, but it is much appreciated since it is in those details that the developers end up leaving a mark of what it is they are truly trying to accomplish with the work. In this case, it's a love letter to B-movie tier series about kaijus that you watched when you were kids in case you didn't notice yet. In a hilariously wild game design choice, it turns out that whenever you finish an episode, there's a chance that a bunch of monster glimpses will just spawn all over the place, as if you just finished the boss and popped open a treasure chest in Diablo, except instead of weapons and armor, you get monster glimpses to make kaiju cards, so you know it's way more valuable. As for the lower screen of the 3DS, it has a map screen like a lot of other 3DS games, with the advantage that this one shows up every possible destination with a helpful number showing which episode will progress where, as well as tabs dedicated to the card game and the usual options menu and the aforementioned spellmaker. The entire game is very well made, all the pieces fit, but if I had to convince someone that there is one remarkable characteristic above all in this game, it would be the same one that stretches across Millennium Kitchen's entire body of work. The world this takes place in is absolutely spectacular. It would be a lie to say their previous works didn't include storylines and character development, but given the change of, shall we say, genre, it is inevitable that this time around the plot would be given a much greater focus since there is no passage of time, and thus no way to simply ignore it as the game moves on. In order to progress, you must engage with the plot and the wonderful characters that inhabit this world. And oh, what wonderful characters you will meet. This is very much a love letter to kaiju media, more specifically old Japanese TV hero series like Ultraman, and this is reflected in the cast. While this isn't the Beyblade world equivalent of kaiju where Godzilla parted the Red Sea, things here are very much subdued. There are people who are living mostly normal lives doing normal things, and every Friday a monster attacks the town and is fought by a team of heroes in a clockwork schedule, just like how you expect every Friday to bring you a new episode of your favorite series. Being the place where the kaiju appears, naturally some of the people living in it are directly related to the appearances. There is a young TV producer trying her best to make the show a smash hit and who has some of the best dialogue ever written in a video game. And then there's also the mysterious writer of the TV show who was interested in kaiju in the first place because of a mysterious encounter he had years before the events of the game. And of course there's also a policeman and a baker and other normal adults with normal jobs who all deal with the kaiju appearances in a very matter-of-fact adult way, doing things like simply warning the children not to stay too late in the day the kaijus appear because, well, to them, this is just routine at this point. Now, you might have noticed I'm being quite a bit vague on the details of the kaiju, and that's very much on purpose, since I don't want to spoil any of the surprises this game has to offer. And the game is just as intentionally vague about it for most of its duration. I believe the reason being that when you are a kid, things kind of are like that. The fictional and the real, particularly when the fictional intentionally blurs the line to make things more exciting, can all mix up in your head, turning the world into your playground, and that really sets the tone of what it must have been to be a kaiju-loving child living in Japan during the 70s. Not to say only the kids matter, the adults have very adult arcs of their own they have to work with, as their lives move on with or without the kaiju, but I ended up relating to pretty much everyone in this story on some level, be their problems big or small. One scene that particularly stuck to me is when the characters go to high ground in order to investigate something and then try to find out more clues by looking over the city, only to immediately declare that nothing's happening, as if something should in fact be happening at all, a few seconds after they got the idea to look in the first place. It's just this incredible, childlike way of thinking that you are looking, therefore you must find something, because that's how it worked in those kaiju shows. They are usually very short, 25-minute long affairs, so in order for any story to fit into that time frame, things must keep progressing at all times non-stop. I don't know if you noticed that, go watch your favorite shows. Things are always moving, even if not the main plot and a subplot, in an interesting way. But that isn't how things work in real life, so the kids must give up on just looking and instead put some actual thought into how to find some kaijus. It's such a short moment, but the reason it stuck to me is because of how easily I was able to identify what was going on and immediately relate to it. You don't need to have grown during the 70s in Japan to relate to these kids. All you need to do is have grown up watching shows of your own, waiting for that magical day when new episodes were released to understand what Attack of the Friday Monsters is going for. Also, props to the team for writing such childlike child characters, given how many writers across all mediums have so much trouble writing children that behave like actual children. So yeah, props to the developers for creating these wonderful characters in this wonderful world. And hey, speaking of world, as a final note before we move on, I'd also like to point out that the environmental storytelling is still stellar in this game as well. Just take a left, just go left, because technically you're going right from your house, but anyway, just go left from the starting screen the moment the game gives you control, and you can see another house with piles of books spread around it, and it's inaccessible, but it's just such an interesting little detail that makes you wonder, what the deal is it with that? Well, it turns out your neighbor is the kaiju show writer, and he has a lot of books in his house because he's a writer. Well then, mystery solved. What about the shop on the main street with a bunch of paint cans all over the entrance? Well, turns out that shop belongs to the family of one of the kids, and they make billboards for local businesses. Another mystery solved. Honestly, the fact everything has a rational explanation to be there just really helps with making the world feel very lived in, even with the limited exploration and amount of characters. And once again, I cannot express how beautiful the pre-rendered backgrounds look. Even narrow back alleys look inviting when done by these devs. See, this girl gets me. The bottom line with Attack of the Friday Monsters: A Tokyo Tale is that it is not as long as a Boku game, being that you can easily finish it in about 3 hours, and it's definitely not the same thing at all, but it is a successful example of what you can do when you try to put on a new spin using the skills you acquire on your previous works. And considering it came packed with 2 other games in Japan and sold individually for very cheap in the rest of the world, I'd say it's definitely a trip worth taking. I was disappointed when I first played it because at the time I just wanted Boku no Natsuyasumi with Kaiju basically, but I'm glad I replayed it after playing the Boku Natsu games for the first time and managed to take a whole lot more from it with the additional context. This one is definitely a recommended if you have a Nintendo 3DS. And that was Millennium's Kitchen Last Game, a small game for a short game collection published by another company on the Nintendo 3DS. Not the most glamorous way of ending your career, but they gave their all and made a good game, and in the end, that's pretty much the best thing a game developer can do. So, what happened with them after that? Well, I have no idea. Recent videos on YouTube from other people that I follow, Thor High Heels, mentioned that they are doing curry right now, which makes complete sense. Like, hey, Millennium Kitchen, they make curry. It fits. But as a game developer, I have no idea about any other projects that they took after Attack of the Friday Monsters. I personally don't think it's like they planned Attack of the Friday Monsters to be their Sun Song, though it was the last title released by them in 2013. Their official website kept posting new content all the way until 2016, 2016 being the same year Sony announced they were planning to bring the Boku no Natsuyasumi franchise to smartphones, though those plans never materialized in any way, shape or form as far as I managed to look into. Cass does mention in his interview with Scroll that he wanted to make a winter vacation title, but instead of Boku no Natsuyasumi, it would be a Watashi no Fuyu Natsumi, which would basically be a girl version, possibly starring Midori, Boku's cousin from the third game, but that too seems to be shelved at this moment. The truth is, if anyone owns the rights to this franchise right now, even if it's just partial rights, it's definitely Sony. And with recent news that they've been winding down their original Japanese development studio and pretty much leaving Japanese development in the dust, at the time of finishing writing this script, it honestly looks like the PlayStation brand has completely forsaken their Japanese heritage, leaving the more experimental side of games to indie developers and only backing Western studios so they can release about 2 cinematic-focused games per year, since that strategy seems to be working out for them so far. So the chances of a new Boku no Natsuyasumi or even a translated remaster of one of the previous games seem pretty grim. Never say never, as they say, but I wouldn't hold my breath either. So, in my personal opinion, which you are free to disagree with, maybe I'm just too personally involved in this, but in my personal opinion, it's up to the fans to carry the torch now. People need to gather together and make fan translations and make some indie titles inspired by the works of Millennium Kitchen. It's time to get our hands dirty and do the franchise justice, just like how Team Reptile is currently resurrecting Jet Set Radio, since Sega clearly didn't want to do anything with it for decades. Part of the reason I decided to do this retrospective and to explain in painful detail about the gameplay loops is because I sincerely enjoy them, and also because there's plenty of good stuff here that could inspire someone someday to make something great. It's painful when a title doesn't get a worldwide release because we are left wondering just how that title could have changed the course of history if some of today's greatest developers had a chance to play them and draw inspiration from them. And I sure hope you managed to take something away from this series. It doesn't have to be this grandiose. Whether you decided to go brush your Japanese skills to pick up the game themselves, or whether you are a developer who got inspired by what I've talked about in the series, or even if you just decided to watch this on YouTube for fun and had a good time, I sincerely hope this series added to your life in a positive way. And with that, I thank you for watching this to the very end. Now, it's up to us to carry the memories of these summer vacations so they shall never be forgotten. And this is where I was planning to end the video, but oh shit son, breaking news, bet you didn't see that coming, did you?
夏休みを九州で過ごすことになったしんちゃんと野原一家。
Because you see, it turns out in the Japanese version of the latest Nintendo Direct, they announced a Shin-chan game, but not just any Shin-chan game, a Boku no Natsuyasumi style Shin-chan game, directed by Kazuhiro Ayabe himself, and while it's apparently being published by a company called Neos, the Japanese Wikipedia page clearly lists Millennium Kitchen as working on it, so they're not just making curry. Even better, the place of the speech bubbles shows horizontal text, the placement, which would be easier to localize compared to Bokunatsu's original vertical text. Plus, Shin-chan is very popular in countries like Spain and even already got a localized Switch game, and Kazuhiro Ayabe himself took a question on Twitter to answer that he will try his best to release this game in Europe. So, hell yeah, get fucking hype, because the stars have seemingly aligned themselves to finally get us a Boku no Natsuyasumi game in English. You know, I was planning on ending this on kind of a bittersweet note, maybe play one of the slower, more calm songs of the soundtrack and kind of like fade away, you know, and honestly, I completely forgot my plans when this got announced because of how hype I got, and you know, sometimes good things happen. Sometimes good things just happen, and I'm glad that I'm going to end this not with the bittersweet note of a series that has long been finished, but instead of one whose future looks in fact bright and that there is hope in the horizon for more releases. And that's it basically. I'm just overwhelmingly really happy right now to give you guys these news. But you know, don't get too lazy, do keep carrying that torch and keeping your part in keeping the dream alive, you know, because that's how good things happen. It's been quite a journey, an entire year has already almost passed from the release date of the first part, and I'll keep on keeping on. See you guys next time.